Open disaggregated network architectures are now regarded by many as the inevitable future of the communications sector, but it's still early days for this trend. So to find out about the key advantages and challenges associated with the deployment and operation of open cloud-native disaggregated networks, I'm talking today with a distinguished panel of speakers who are experts in the field. So let's meet them. Kenji Kumaki is General Manager and Chief Architect at KDDI in Japan. Inbar Lasser-Raab is the CMO at DriveNets. John Laban is the open source technology community builder for the Open Compute Project Foundation and OpenUK. And Anurag Shrivastava is GM and Head of Network Services at Wipro. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today for what I know is going to be a great discussion. So let's start by finding out what is driving the market interest in disaggregated cloud-native network architectures. Kumaki-san, let's start with you. Is this an approach that KDDI is taking?
I think network scalability, flexibility, and reliability are required in carrier networks. We've provided both fixed line and mobile services for consumers and enterprises, and deployed both 5G NSA and SVA regarding mobile services. Actually, most of consumers use OTT applications like YouTube, Amazon Prime, Instagram, and Netflix. So traffic has been increasing like tsunami every year. Obviously, we have to control really huge traffic in backbone areas like backbone core, edge, and the internet gateway. In that sense, it's very important for us to prepare high-capacity routers that scale up and scale out at the same time from network scalability perspective. Also, router architecture should be same in not only backbone areas, but other areas like data center, access networks from network flexibility perspective. Because we don't have to put different types of routers in all areas. But until now, we carriers have to put different types of routers in each area due to router scalability and flexibility issue. So what the router architecture is the same really helps us to start a faster network rollout and reduce CapEx and OpEx as well. Furthermore, even if a failure happens in production networks, we have to fix it as soon as possible before a service outage from network reliability perspective. Maybe I think it's better to fix issues within a second or something. So disaggregated routers are required to have those key factors in carrier networks. And I believe the disaggregated routers should have such factors.
Thank you, Kumaki-san, for the view from KDDI. And Inbar, what are you finding are the drivers for operators to move towards disaggregated network architectures?
So what drives the market right now, as Kumaki-san just said, is really the fact that the cloud model works. The cloud models help scale, lower cost, enables multiple services to be rolled out over a single shared infrastructure. And that's what drove the market to begin with. When we came out 3 years ago, the fact that the model lowers cost, enables scaling, was really the motivation behind service providers adopting our solution. But what we found out in the last few years working with operators is that actually the ability to innovate much faster is the main driver. When you move everything to software like we did, where all of the network is software-based, you can run multiple networks and services over a shared physical infrastructure, that allows innovation to go out much faster, adding more services, rolling them out much quicker. And that is what really appeals to service providers today. Competition is fierce, new models are coming out, and the fact that the infrastructure and the network is so agile, it's software-based, you can roll out new capabilities much faster, is really what appeals to service providers and what makes them adopt the solution much faster.
Okay, yes, it's hard to see that these drivers are going to continue and get stronger in the years ahead. Now, is disaggregated networking particularly suitable for a certain part of a communications network, say the radio access network or the mobile core or the IP/MPLS networking, maybe even the fixed broadband access? Or can it be applied to any of these use cases, any part of the network? John, let's come to you on this.
Well, I believe it's got a space in every location. The question is, it's a new technology, and the telcos are they're very wary about making changes. I'm an ex-telco person, and I understand that they tend to stick with what they know. Now, how do you move into the new use case? I think you have to first identify where your major benefits will accrue from. So it's a little bit like Pareto analysis. You look at 20% of the items that are causing you 80% of the headaches. And if you can focus down on that 20% and apply that, then you'll make life easier moving forward. Another key thing is, don't do it all at once, and try and work within a community where you can get more help, because when you're on your own, you feel isolated, and there's so much that you can gain from working in communities to do the transition.
Okay, excellent. Good advice there, John. And Kumaki-san, is it KDDI's experience that this disaggregated approach can be applied to lots of different parts of the network?
Well, I think disaggregated routers can be deployed in IP/MPLS networks like backbone core, edge, and internet gateway peering. As I mentioned before, we carriers have to control really huge traffic at those areas. Actually, from the router architecture perspective, for example, distributed disaggregated routers consist of NCP and NCF, like line card and fabrics. In that sense, we can scale up and scale out the distributed disaggregated routers at the same time as we can put NCP and NCF horizontally, depending on how much capacity we need as a scale out. And we also can upgrade the existing NCPs to new high capacity NCPs as a scale up. So we are thinking about the distributed disaggregated routers as backbone core, edge, and internet gateway peering.
So lots of different deployment options there, but this is still very early days in this trend. So what are the primary challenges, whether commercial, technological, or operational, that disaggregated networking adopters must overcome to achieve success with a network based on cloud-native architectures? Anurag, let's come to you on this.
Thanks. So being part of the service integrated company, what we have experiencing is that the biggest challenge what telcos are facing is actually the sourcing strategy. The reason being is all these telcos already have private networks or a telco grade network which has grown over the years, and now the new technology has to integrate with the rest of the ecosystem what the telcos are having, and having the hybrid network in place so as to deliver end-to-end quality of service which is promised to the end customer is really a challenge. Now the journey begins with actually testing the entire open networks or disaggregated networks in a lab environment, and to ensure that all the multi-vendor ecosystem which is existing in the telco's network coexists with the disaggregated network, which is being promised as delivering high grade of service. Now the second biggest problem what I see is the source in terms of who takes the ownership. Earlier, when the field was dominated by the OEMs, it was a single person to catch on in case of any operational issue, right? They used to supply, they used to roll out, they used to maintain and take the EMCs. Everything end-to-end service was made possible. Now, in this scenario, when we have software and hardware coming from a different vendor and the integration is happening by maybe a third party, who owns the end-to-end service availability, who owns the acceptance testing, who owns the integrated service quality? So sourcing strategy is becoming a biggest challenge for telcos to adopt. So these are the primary challenges from the operational side as well as on the commercial side. Having said that, just the another problem with the commercial aspect is that the service integrators are finding it too difficult to take the risk in case they own end-to-end. So while the stake for the service integrators will be comparatively less, but they take the front seat and hence the ownership becomes too high. It is too risky a business to get into. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anurag. Yes, a lot of moving parts there. Inbar, what are you seeing from DriveNets' experience? What are you seeing as the main challenges for the network operators?
The main challenge that we see is the fact that it's just a new model. It's a new operation model. The disaggregated, you buy software from one vendor and hardware from another vendor, and then the integration with the system integrators, like we just heard from Anurag. That is actually the uncomfortable feeling that operators have initially. It's a new model. They're used to getting everything from one vendor. But once they get over it, and actually what DriveNets has done to help them feel more comfortable with this new model is the fact that we took the responsibility to be that front line, that one throat to choke, if you like, where we roll out new software, we make sure we test it with the full solution, with all the different hardware and white boxes available out there. The fact that we are the first line of support, so when there is an issue, they call us. So that really helped ease the concerns around that new model. But when they get used to the new model, they realize there are great benefits to that distributed operational model. And the fact that now we had to build automation into the infrastructure. When you work with multiple vendors, we need to make sure that it operates as if it came from a single vendor. So we automated the provisioning. We automated a lot of tasks that before weren't automated. We treat it as a single system. And we also provided greater visibility. When you have hardware coming from one vendor and software coming from another, you need to provide greater visibility to enable troubleshooting. So what we heard from our partners who've been deploying those networks with service providers is that greater visibility, that automation actually enabled that new disaggregated model to be much more efficient than the traditional monolithic ones. So rollout is faster, troubleshooting is faster, there is more visibility. So what we realized that the biggest concern and the fact that we invested a lot of effort in addressing that biggest concern became a big benefit of the new model. So we're still working, we're still educating the market, but I think service providers are realizing the world is moving to a disaggregated model. It worked really well in the cloud. It's going to work really well in the network cloud or in the network. And it's becoming less and less of an issue.
Yes, absolutely. It's a leap of faith, but there are advantages, and obviously we've been hearing that from KDDI. John, what do you see as the biggest challenges for the network operators here?
I think it's mindset. I think it would be very useful if the telco operators spent a few months in the hyperscale data centers. The hyperscale data centers are the people who have developed these cloud native solutions. And when you go into these hyperscale data centers, it's just a revolution. It's a revolution in so many ways. Just in the amount of support people that are required. In a hyperscale data center, you'll get like 99% less people looking after the installation compared to a traditional on-premise enterprise data center. And that's really key. And the survivability of the telcos in the future is they need to massively reduce their costs, especially as they move into the high investments of 5G build-outs. So I think they need to really study what the hyperscalers have done. And I think once they get familiar, and this is the bit about the community, if they start working with these players, the hyperscalers, they're very generous, they're all very generous. It's open source, they give it away. Go and learn from the hyperscalers.
Yes, there's certainly a lot to be learned from the cloud community and the first movers as well, of of which KDDI is one. Kumaki-san, from KDDI's experience, what were the main hurdles that were needed to be overcome to move towards this disaggregated model?
Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, we carriers require network scalability, flexibility, and reliability in carrier production networks. So we carriers have to make sure that disaggregated routers work well in carrier production networks from scalability, flexibility, and reliability perspective. So first, we have to evaluate such routers that can scale up and scale out at the same time from scalability perspective. And then we can add or remove routers without any impact of traffic from flexibility and reliability perspective. Finally, the interoperability with the existing router is also really important thing as we've already deployed other vendors.
Yes, that's an absolutely key point because there are very few greenfield networks out there, and there's going to be a mix of legacy and new as operators deploy these kinds of technologies. So those are some of the challenges that some operators are already starting to overcome. But what are the key business, technological and operational benefits associated with the successful deployment and use of disaggregated cloud-native network architectures? John, let's come to you first.
Operational costs are substantially reduced. CapEx costs are substantially reduced. And as I mentioned earlier, people costs are substantially reduced. And people are a very large kind of cost within a business. And through automation and resilient networks that kind of self-heal, you don't have to do this break fix all the time that you get one router fails that you have to rush in. You don't need to do that because you have these kind of mesh networks, these cloud-based networks. You don't need to do that. Another thing is speed of implementation. When you're building out with cloud-native solutions, it really is quite simple. And again, if you go into the hyperscalers and see how they do that, then you'll get a realization. But in cloud-native data centers, 2 technicians can install like 3,000 servers in a day, and they don't really need to know very much. All they need to know is where to plug some fiber optic cables and some power cables. And I think that's really key to the whole equation. Is it's a connect the business requirement that you can't carry on with these monolithic solutions and the lock-in that you had before and the high costs. When you've got telcos coming online, you've got Rakuten coming in aggressively. Watch Rakuten over the next decade. And if you don't move, they'll eat you for breakfast.
Yeah, absolutely. Scale is so essential, and the traffic capacity that's needed to be managed is just becoming unsustainable for legacy networks. Kumaki-san, are you starting to see some of these benefits already at KDDI?
Yeah, John said the cost cutting. So I have same opinion because the disaggregated routers consist of different combination of software and hardware. So we can choose any hardware or software vendors if they support this architecture. Meaning we can choose competitive vendors that include the existing router vendors. Actually, we are able to reduce capex as the existing router vendors try to compete with new hardware and software vendors. In that sense, we can have more options to choose router vendors. Before, we are able to choose only the existing router vendors. I would say we had no choice for backbone areas. Actually, as you know, the existing router vendors were really, really strong. But now we can choose new additional hardware and software vendors. That's a really, really good thing for carriers, I think.
Okay, Kumaki-san, thanks very much. Clear that KDDI is seeing advantages already from its move towards disaggregation. And obviously disaggregation in networking is not a new idea, it's not a new concept. So how has it evolved since its inception and where do you see it evolving from here? John, let's come to you on this first.
Yeah, it's definitely not a new idea. What it is, though, is a new kind of psychology. It's basically moving towards software. And software has this ability to create incredible agility in networks that you need to change. It's very, very useful for scaling out, as you know, when you start to get the telcos need to scale out fast, the hyperscalers need to scale out fast. It's a very, very simple automated operation. And I think it's basically an inevitable thing that's happening. Software is eating the world. It's eating the physical world. And there's plenty of examples of how software eats the world. If you go into a cloud native data center, and for me, what a cloud native data center is, or a cloud native enabled telco, is fundamentally that it's software eating the physical infrastructure. And it's quite profound when you start to virtualize instances using Linux containers and Kubernetes. You can start to pump up the actual workloads on the same piece of hardware. And there's plenty of examples on cloud native dematerialization, it's called, where the software optimizes the hardware to such a point that it reduces the amount of hardware that you need by 80%. And that's quite a profound and exciting thing to happen. So the software eating the physical infrastructure is key. Another thing that very few people seem to focus on is if the software is eating the physical hardware, not only does things get simpler and quicker to implement and quicker to scale out and more agile because there's less stuff you have to shift, and there's this common kind of infrastructure. You don't have to do all these complex configurations every time you want to make a move. But it's going to be key to the business survival of telcos. The telcos that move into the software-defined solutions, where software takes control of the infrastructure, are going to be the winners in the future. And what I do have a concern with is there are some telcos, and I've been working with telcos for a long time on this, and they are very, very, very slow in their adoption. They're doing their proof of concepts at small scale. And while this is happening, there's these new kind of telco innovators, the likes, as I mentioned before, like Rakuten, who are coming through very, very fast and building their infrastructures very fast. Rakuten completing their infrastructure, their 5G infrastructure in Japan 5 years ahead of schedule on a much, much lower budget than if you were using the monolithic solutions from the few players in the market that were there before. But there's one other thing I think we need to mention, and it's this. It's the sustainability side, the environmental impact of IT infrastructures. And when you start using these software solutions, you actually massively reduce your energy consumption and also your carbon emissions. And a lot of people really haven't measured this yet, because when you start to measure the whole life carbon emissions of an infrastructure, an IT infrastructure, a telco infrastructure or a data center, what you tend to find is that somewhere in the region, probably more than 80% of all your emissions are to do with the embodied carbon in the hardware. Now, if you're using software to dematerialize the hardware, you can see it has a huge impact on decarbonisation. And there's a wonderful, wonderful presentation done by the CTO at Comcast in one of the ONF summits. And he shows this wonderful presentation. He shows the before picture and he shows the after picture, and he shows a 90% dematerialization in their infrastructure by the adoption of these open source software technologies built on commoditized white boxes. So I think that's really going to be very exciting. And And people will have to move to it because new policies coming in from the politicians, the policymakers on carbon emissions and the penalties that you will pay if you are a big emitter are going to drive this technology even faster. But lots of people are not aware of it yet because they're not measuring holistic carbon emissions.
Yeah, sustainability is definitely more than just lip service these days and really starting to impact strategies. Kumaki-san, how do you see this trend evolving in the future? How is disaggregation going to move forward in terms of the way it impacts networks?
Well, I want to talk about this from carrier network perspective. The disaggregation in networking is accelerating in 5G and next gen 6G era. Actually, we carrier have put telco, OTT, public cloud in carrier production network. For example, those clouds are put a major city here in Japan, but those clouds will be more distributed than now, meaning those clouds will be put at minor city as well. And delay-sensitive traffic should be treated in some local areas, like a minor city, in order to reduce network latency and the amount of traffic in the backbone area. For example, voice, video, and gaming, something like that. But still, the rest of traffic should be treated widely, maybe nationwide or something like that. Also, traffic itself we have to control will be increasing because we have a lot of devices in 5G and next gen 6G era, obviously. So I think disaggregated routers should be more scalable, flexible, and reliable than now.
Okay, thank you, Kumaki-san. And clearly, I think we're just at the beginning of this journey towards disaggregation in communications networks, and we're just going to see a much greater impact of this trend in the years to come, and hopefully many advantages for the network operators. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of our speakers today, Kumaki-san, Inbar, John, and Anurag. Thank you very much for joining us.